The highway woke before the town did. Dawn slid up over the northern Arizona desert, slow and merciless, peeling shadows off the red rock and sage-like old skin. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cut a straight, stubborn line through it, all the kind of road that belonged more to memory than to modern traffic. No billboards, no subdivisions, just a faded center stripe and miles of dirt that didn't care who lived or who died. A Harley moved through that emptiness like a low rolling storm. Black tank chrome dulled by years' exhaust rumble, deep as a warning. The rider leaned into the cold leather, creaking with each breath. His hands knew this machine better than they knew any human face. Metal never lied to him. People always had. He counted the funerals without meaning to. One for cancer, slow and vicious. One for a heart that simply quit mid-step. One for a bike that slid wrong on the interstate and didn't give second chances. 3 caskets in 12 months, 3 patches retired forever. Every mile of this ride pressed those numbers deeper into his spine. The club was shrinking, the hair in the mirror was whiter every year, and the letters from the bank and the IRS stacked taller on Ledger's desk. He scanned the empty road ahead and knew the truth he hadn't spoken out loud yet. They were the last of a breed that nobody had ordered anymore. The engine coughed a subtle hitch that only an old rider would hear. A faint smear of oil on the back of his boot told him the primary was leaking again. The next town wasn't a town so much as a pause in the highway, Copper Ridge, 3,000 souls on paper, and maybe half that awake at 6 in the morning. One gas station, one diner, one idea of home that had never been his. Fluorescent tubes buzzed above the pumps, throwing out a sickly blue-white glow over an empty lot. A single semi set off to the side cab, dark driver somewhere between consciousness and another long haul. The frigidity in the air bit through leather and denim. Desert cold didn't need wind to make its point. He rolled the Harley up under the buzzing canopy and killed the engine. The silence that followed was loud enough to hurt. Metal ticked as it cooled. His knuckles ached when he bent to inspect the leak, an old ache from old work. The asphalt under his boots was stained with stories of other breakdowns and other travelers who had passed through and never looked back. Movement brushed the edge of his vision, not the lazy sway of a trash bag or the flutter of some loose poster. This was small, compact wrong in the way that made every sense he'd sharpened in war and on the streets come online at once. He let his gaze drift that way without turning his head, the way he'd learned when looking straight at danger meant dying first. Something sat on the curb near the far corner of the lot, 50 feet away, maybe more. At first glance, it was just a bundle of fabric and shadow, too low to be an adult, too still to be drunk. The stillness was what snagged him. People sleeping, rough, twitched, shifted, guarded what little they had. This shape was rigid, spine locked as if the air itself were a weight. He straightened slowly, wiped oil from his fingers onto a rag and took a second look. Small sneakers, one toe split open in a crescent, thin legs drawn up, knees close to chest, an oversized backpack slumped against a narrow back, a jacket that had lost its insulation seasons ago, hair tangled around a bowed head, hands busy, not fidgeting, but working a fingertip, pulling threads from that worn-out shoe, methodical and precise, as if unraveling fabric could unravel the situation. No tears, no visible plea, just that work and that stillness. He recognized the look without needing to see the eyes. It lived in bathroom mirrors and metal surfaces polished enough to reflect. The look of someone who had learned early that crying made things worse, not better. The look of a kid who had heard in one form or another that they were a burden the world regretted. A thought came uninvited and clear. You keep riding, nobody blames you. Another followed, heavier, older. You stop. You can't ever pretend you didn't see. The cold got deeper, or maybe that was just his pulse slowing as he wrestled options into order. Call the cops and she'd vanish into a system that mishandled people like broken shipments. Pretend she wasn't there and spend the next decade remembering this morning every time he tried to sleep. Or sit on that concrete and drag old ghosts into the open for a stranger who didn't ask for him. His boots carried him anyway. He kept his distance at first, stopping a good 15 feet away. Leather denim patchwork of scars, a back patch that would scare half the parents in town. It all made him look like exactly the kind of man children were warned about. He dropped into a crouch, knees complaining, making himself smaller without thinking about what that meant. You lost. The words came out low, roughened by cigarettes and years, but there was no bark in them. A tiny shake of the head so slight the movement almost vanished in the breath that followed. Somebody coming for you. The jaw tightened. No sound. The fingers kept worrying the torn shoe. How long you been here? A pause long enough to count to 20. Then a whisper, don't know. It was dark. The attendant inside the station sat behind smudged glass, face lit by a phone held too close. The security camera above the door pointed toward the pumps, not the curb. The trucker might as well have been on another planet. For the last however many hours, the child on the curb had been invisible to everyone but the cold. In war, he'd been taught to run probability matrices in the time it took a shell to fall. Here the calculus felt heavier. He asked about food and watched the small head tilt just enough to answer no. The hunger sat in the hollows beneath cheekbones and in the way hands trembled when they paused their work. He went inside, grabbed the freshest-looking sandwiches in plastic, a bottle of water coffee, black enough to pass for oil. The attendant took his cash without looking up, as if human exchange cost extra. Back at the curb, he sank down 3 feet away from the kid, the concrete leaching heat through denim. No lecture, no questions, just the soft rustle of plastic as he unwrapped a sandwich and held it out. Small fingers took it like an animal expecting the trap to spring any second. The first bite was too big, almost tearing the bread, but the chewing stayed silent. Hunger ate sound too. They sat like that through several minutes. The sun used to climb higher over the lot. A truck out on the highway downshifted, a bird yelled once from a power line, and his coffee went from hot to lukewarm between one breath and the next. My stepdad said I cost too much money. The words floated into the air like she was reporting the weather. He let the coffee burn a line down his throat before answering. Yeah, Mom's other boyfriend before him hit me. A swallow. The sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. This one just didn't want me around. The concrete had a way of sharpening memory. He was 9 again, the sting of a belt across his back, the smell of alcohol and sweat, the words "you're nothing" carved into the air. He was 20-something in a desert on the other side of the world, holding a man's hand while sand stuck to blood, and the medevac was always 12 minutes too far away. This child had none of the armor the men he'd tried to save had carried. No training, no flak, no rifle. Just a backpack and a torn shoe. He drove me here yesterday, the small voice continued. 7 in the morning, gave me $12. Said figure it out. The padding from the sandwich wrapper crinkled under her grip. I bought crackers and Gatorade. Then it got dark. She didn't have to finish the sentence. The dumpster behind the building had a shadow tucked against it that clung a little too long to the ground. He filled in the rest. Why this place? He said someone would come. A shrug so slight it was almost a flinch. I thought maybe never came. Until now, somewhere between the last swallow of coffee and the next breath, the line between his past and this moment blurred. War had trained him to move when others froze, to step forward into gunfire because waiting meant more casualties. This wasn't gunfire, but the stakes felt sharper. A thought settled in like a gear locking into place. You've been waiting your whole life for a fight that mattered more than your own damage. Here it is. He heard his own voice before he fully decided on the words. I'm taking you somewhere else. The small head turned finally just enough for him to see eyes wary, ringed in bruised fatigue, but not hollow yet. We're somewhere with heat, food, people who know how to keep someone safe. You promises had dragged men into situations they never got out of. But there were oaths heavier than fear. I'm not leaving you here. That's the only promise that counts. Are you a bad man? The question hit harder than any punch. A dozen images punched back fists that weren't his orders, followed fights taken too far, nights spent staring at the ceiling, wishing he could forget the faces of men who didn't deserve what they got. I've done bad things, he heard himself admit. In places where everyone was doing bad things because someone wearing a tie told us it was necessary. I wake up every day trying to earn a different ending. Silence stretched thin and brittle as ice. Okay, just that. A single word that weighed more than all the others combined. Names came next. They always did when war shifted to camp. Hers fell into the space between them and stayed there, no longer just another anonymous casualty waiting to happen. The logistics of extracting one small person from a bad situation would have been simple on paper. Secure the bag, secure the body, Move. In reality, the first flinch when the Harley roared back to life told him he was asking her to step out of one world and onto the back of a machine built for the kind of men she'd been told to fear. He showed her where to put her hands, how to lock fingers together, how to hold tight without choking. Her arms slipped around his waist, tentative at first, then firm, as she realized the only way not to fall was to trust his balance completely. The contact landed like a weight across his ribs. The gas station receded in the mirrors, a cheap island of buzzing light shrinking against an ocean of stone and scrub. The kid clung to him, helmet slightly too big, bouncing against the back of his jacket. Every mile put the curb farther behind them and pulled them closer to something he couldn't yet name. The compound rose out of the desert the way all good fortresses did, not grand, but stubborn. A fence, a gate warned buildings repurposed into sanctuary. The sign didn't say much. The patches on the men who guarded the entrance said everything that mattered. The guard stepped out as the Harley approached, eyes narrowing at the second helmet visible behind the first. Surprise flickered and then slid away beneath an older, deeper understanding. In this place, the rule was simple. If you brought someone past the gate, you were vouching with more than your patch. You were vouching with your life. The gate rolled open. Sunday morning meant bikes on stands, tools clinking, wood chopped in preparation for winter smoke, curling from a grill behind the main building. The arrival of a passenger turned heads the way a dropped wrench did in a quiet shop. Not hostile, just alert. A big man with a beard like drifted snow stepped forward, rag in hand, forearms stained with grease and ink from decades back. His gaze flicked from rider to child and back again, reading a story that didn't need words. "You like eggs," he rumbled toward the small figure stiff on the passenger seat. "I make decent eggs." A barely visible nod. "Good, we'll start there." While the kitchen warmed and plates clinked, the others gathered where serious business always took place, a room with a long table scarred by years of discussions. Nobody outside would ever hear about, walls hung with flags and photos of faces that never aged past the frame. 20 men, give or take, took their seats with the same deliberate gravity they'd once carried into briefing tents and ready rooms. Some bodies were thick, with muscles on heavy. Others had the wiry toughness of men who'd stayed lean because their nerves never quite relaxed. The common thread was in their eyes, the thousand-yard stare converted into something gentler, but never fully erased. The story laid out on the table was simple in structure and brutal in implication. An 8-year-old abandoned at a gas station, 24 hours alone, no sign of a mother. A stepfather who had weaponized neglect instead of fists. A ride that ended at their door because a man whose moral compass had been shattered and soldered back together knew he couldn't leave her where she was. On another table miles away sat audit letters and overdue notices. Calories cost money, legal battles cost blood. The treasurer rubbed his eyes not at the girl's plight, but at a future filled with court dates and caseworkers. "If we do this," the numbers in the room pointed out, "we bring the state into our house. We invite scrutiny we've spent decades avoiding. They see leather ink and rap sheets, not the good we've done. They'll come for our charter, our land, our freedom." A man who rarely spoke placed a creased photograph on the scarred wood. The image of a toddler frozen in some past summer almost glowed against the shadows. He talked, halting at first, about returning from a war. Nobody wanted to acknowledge about nightmares mistaken for insanity, about a state worker with a clipboard deciding he was unfit to be a father. 40 years of silence poured into a few simple sentences. "I had a daughter," he managed. "I lost her because no one believed I could change. I will not watch another child get thrown away if I can help it." Sometimes an entire room shifts on a sentence. The eldest among them rose, last arthritis, fighting him for every inch. He spoke about rules, not feelings. If they did this, they would do it the way they'd always done, what mattered, disciplined, documented, clean. Every man who came within reach of the child would be checked and double-checked. Agencies would be notified not as adversaries but as allies, forced to see their competence. "We have been called animals in leather," his voice rasped. "Fine. Let them call us what they want. We know who we are. A pack protects its young." The vote was not dramatic. No slam fists, no shouted slogans. Just a series of nods, one after another, until a quiet unanimity settled over the table. The mission shifted from implied to official in that moment. Outside, the girl sat at a bar stool too tall for her legs while eggs sizzled and coffee percolated. She had been raised to fear men who looked like this rough, loud, marked with symbols she'd been told were signs of danger. Yet nothing in the room had moved toward her with malice. Plates appeared. A blanket materialized. A woman with the calm competence of someone who had raised children found clothes in storage that nearly fit. When night came and she lay under a roof that didn't threaten to fall on her, he stood in the doorway watching the small rise and fall of her breathing. The question floated from the darkness. Are you my dad now? There were a dozen technical answers. Guardianship forms, emergency placement, jargon, timelines for legal adoption. None of that fit in the sliver of silence between them. I'm not going anywhere, he told the shadows. You can count on that. Good night, Dad. The word landed like a rank pin pinned to his chest in boot camp, unearned and heavy with expectation. On the trailer steps under a sky pricked with cold stars, another Patch brother eased himself down beside him. The two men stared at the dark horizon. You've carried wounded men through minefields, the other man reminded him. This is going to be harder. War ends, he murmured. Kids don't. The first week stripped away any illusion that a rescue at a gas station solved much beyond immediate survival. The third night screams ripped through the thin walls at 2 a.m. Not the quick shout of a bad dream, but the strangled, choking howl of someone trapped between past and present. The woman who had tucked the girl into bed tried to wake her to no avail. Limbs flailed, hands clawed, lungs hauled in air too fast to be useful. He wrapped his arms around the small body, not to confine but to anchor. The words he'd once used to pull a fellow Marine out of a flashback came out of their own accord. You're here. You're safe. Nobody's coming through that door without going through me first. 10 endless minutes later, the girl broke the surface of her nightmare and sobbed herself empty into his shoulder. Morning light would reveal old burns on young skin, circular scars that matched the diameter of a cigarette tip. Goodbye gift, she labeled them without emotion. Rage had a taste metallic and hot. It drove him into the shop, fists beating a heavy bag until skin split and bruises bloomed. The urge to hunt down the man who'd done this and end him with his bare hands pulsed behind every blow. You break your bones on that canvas, that's on you, his bearded friend grunted from the doorway. It doesn't put food in her stomach. It doesn't calm her at 3 a.m. You want to help her, you out stubborn? The nightmares, day after day after day. Nobody had taught them that after their wars. They were improvising what they'd needed decades too late. Food vanished from the kitchen at odd intervals. Cans, bread, snacks. At first they thought one of the men was skimming out of habit. Then he checked under the child's bed and found a hoarded stash, a private pantry assembled out of panic. Kid, there's always food here, he told her later, holding up a can. You don't need to hide it. They said that before her face went blank. Then there wasn't. He put the can back under the bed. The trust they were building would not be forced by empty promises. Instead, he made a mental note to quietly add fresh items, let her see the supply never truly ran out. She tracked his footsteps the way a soldier tracks incoming fire. To the bathroom door, to the truck, to the shop. The first time he left the compound without her, a simple run for parts and groceries, she hyperventilated until Martha wrapped her in a blanket and sat with her on the floor. She doesn't believe exits come with returns, the older woman explained when he came back to find her shaken and furious with himself. Her experience says goodbye is permanent. You have to prove otherwise. Over and over, the men adjusted, voices lowered when they stepped into the trailer. Boots scuffed less, weapons disappeared into safes. Jokes about violence died on tongues before they turned into sound. A brother who had spent years wrestling his own hypervigilance gathered them for a quiet briefing in the common room, sketching out trauma responses on a whiteboard that had once held rote plans. Announce yourself before you enter a space, he instructed. No slamming doors, no grabbing from behind as a joke. You treat her like a combat vet until she proves she's sleeping through the night. The school battle started with a glass door and a nameplate on oak. The principal's office looked like every mid-level administrator's domain, framed certificates, shelves of binders, a flag in the corner. Behind the desk sat a man with graying hair, a tie knotted exactly at the throat, service medals displayed in a tasteful arrangement on the wall. He had worn a uniform once, but never mud on his boots. His wars were fought with reports and pen strokes. "You're ironclad," he observed when leather and patches crossed his threshold. "Yeah, and you want to enroll a child here." A folder thumped softly onto the desk. Manila edges smudged from handling. Emergency guardianship papers, a case number, a contact at Child Protective Services, documentation of abandonment at a commercial property. All by the book, all collected at a speed government agencies didn't usually move. The principal probed, flipping pages. Location unknown. The stepfather drove away and left her on concrete. The principal's jaw worked once, then tightened. The concern in his eyes wasn't for the girl. It was for the liability of letting bikers claim parental roles within his school roster. "I cannot in good conscience place a vulnerable minor in an environment that," the biker's gaze flicked to the metal arrangement on the wall. "Commendations earned far from incoming fire." "You served," administrative, the man acknowledges, "stateside. Some of us in my house served where paper didn't matter. There was no boast in the statement, just fact. We took orders, buried friends, came home with pieces missing. The system dumped us on the curb and wished us luck. We built our own structure because nobody else would." He nodded toward the folder. "That little girl would still be behind a dumpster if we hadn't taken initiative. We contacted CPS before we brought her home. We're doing the job your forms don't do fast enough. In any case of concern," the principal tried again, clinging to procedure, "I am obligated to involve the proper authorities. You should." The biker agreed. "They already know. They already approved temporary placement. Call them. Confirm it. Check us out. Put every spotlight on us you want. We're not hiding." The principal's shoulders dropped a fraction. Duty wrestled with fear. "We'll place her with a teacher accustomed to complex backgrounds. That's all I'm asking." Out in the truck, the girl watched the school doors through the windshield, fingers whirring the strap of a borrowed backpack. When he returned, he didn't tell her the details of the meeting. He just told her where her classroom would be and that he'd be there at 3. He was. Every day that week. The whispers started before the first homework sheet came home. Parents saw leather in the pickup line and pulled their kids closer. Children repeated whatever fragments they heard at dinner tables back in class. Rosie heard it all. Biker, gang, dangerous, trash. Words thrown around by people who had never once been truly hungry. She responded the only way she knew how, by outworking everyone in the room. Homework came back flawless. Projects showed a focus that made teachers glance twice. She gravitated toward the kid sinking in the corner, the one others avoided because his clothes smelled like a house where adults weren't in charge. She helped him sound out words without calling attention to the effort. She shared her notes and suggested better hiding spots for his fear. When a boy decided to prove himself tough in the cafeteria by blocking her path and demanding lunch money, she measured him the way she'd learned to size up threats on the mat. He was smaller than some of the brothers' kids she'd sparred with, louder than his courage warranted. "My dad's a Marine," she informed him steadily. "My uncles have seen worse men than you break. You really want to be the one who tests what they taught me?" He believed her. Bullies usually did when they saw someone who knew what real damage looked like. The incident never made it to the principal's office. It rippled through the student body in the way that matters more. No one cornered her again. Respect once earned traveled faster than gossip. 6 weeks into the semester, the gym filled with the smells of waxed floors and nervous adults. Parent-teacher night brought a parade of polo shirts, floral blouses, and weary faces into the space where kids usually ran relay races. Folding tables with teacher names on index cards lined the perimeter. Trifold boards displayed art and science experiments like trophies in a quiet war for future success. When the 5 men in leather walked in alongside one small girl, conversation stopped. You could hear the air adjust. Some parents shifted their bodies to form a barrier between their children and the strangers. Others stared, outright curiosity and condemnation mixing in their gaze. The girl led the way, weaving through the crowd with the easy certainty of someone who knew her destination. Her guardians followed, boots thudding softly on lacquered floor. The teacher at the designated table straightened, smoothing the front of her blouse. Worry flickered across her features before training and professionalism smoothed it away. She had taught long enough to know that sometimes the people who looked safest did the most damage, and sometimes the roughest exterior hid the gentlest core. She waited to see which this would be. She handed over a report card. Every box in the academic section was filled with the same letter. She's exceptional, the teacher began, but the word felt insufficient even to her own ears. She produced a separate sheet. We did an assignment on honor. Most kids wrote about superheroes or sports teams. Your daughter wrote this. She read the essay aloud while the men around the table listened with the stiff, awkward attention of people unused to hearing themselves described in heroic terms. Honor, the child had written, was doing what was right when no one watched and when it hurt. It was stopping for someone on a curb when the world had taught you to keep riding. It was men who looked like villains to everyone else teaching you that real strength was gentle and real power was protective. It was keeping your word even when it cost you everything else. By the time the teacher finished, the gym had gone quiet again, but the silence was different now. Less fear, more reckoning. Some parents looked down at their shoes. Others looked at the men and saw something beyond leather and ink for the first time. An older man wearing a battered cap stitched with the name of a faraway war stepped forward, extended a hand and thanked them for their service. The words weren't just for uniforms long ago folded into closets. They were for this too, for the daily grind of showing up for a child who wasn't theirs by blood. Outside under parking lot lights, the girl burst from the building with a smile that made the desert sunrise look half-hearted. She held up the report card, but he was looking at her face, not the paper. Did I make you proud? Pride had been a foreign country to him for a long time. The feeling rising in his chest now was so unfamiliar it almost hurt. I don't think I've ever been prouder of anything. On the ride home, the sun slid down behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in bruises and fire. The custom seat that had been welded and bolted together in the shop cushioned the small weight against his back. 5 bikes formed a loose cage around them, engines humming in harmony. Back at the compound, paperwork waited, court dates lined up, appointments with caseworkers loomed. The future held dentists and parents' signatures and late-night fevers and schoolyard politics. It held more nightmares and fights with bureaucracy and long, aching days when damage left by other hand bled through the new paint they were carefully applying. For the moment, though, it held this, a stretch of road, a child secure behind an old warrior, and a brotherhood closing ranks around both. Days became weeks, weeks stacked into months. The mission shifted from a rescue to a raising, from a single choice at a gas station to 1,000 daily decisions to stay, to show up, to fight the slow battles that never made headlines. Somewhere in the middle of those first 6 months, without any ceremony, a house full of aging veterans started to learn what it meant to forge a warrior for a life they would never see. The desert mornings changed around her before she ever realized she had changed with them. By the time she turned 9, the compound had become less a refuge and more a forge, hot, unforgiving, relentless in its push to turn a frightened child into someone capable of holding her own weight. The older men didn't shape her through lectures or gentle encouragement. They shaped her the same way they shaped steel: heat, pressure, and patience applied in exactly the amounts needed to keep something from shattering. Grizzly started it. Every Sunday at sunrise, he called her to the fire pit behind the clubhouse. The flames were low, the coals steady, the desert still hushed. He laid a weathered wooden box on the picnic table each week, as if performing a ritual only the two of them understood. Inside were medals dulled by dust and decades campaign ribbons, commendations, fragments of a soldier's life compressed into metal small enough to fit into a child's hand. He let her trace the edges without flinching at how cold they felt. "They're not trophies," he breathed as she studied each piece. "They're receipts. Every one of them cost something." She absorbed the gravity of that long before she grasped the history behind it. At 10, she asked the question that had been building behind her ribs for months. If the world kept hurting you, why'd you keep going back? His jaw tightened, but his answer came without hesitation. Somebody has to stand between wolves and sheep. She felt something pull taut inside her, a thread she hadn't known existed, linking her to him, to Cole, to every grizzled face inside those gates. They weren't trying to raise her into someone harmless. They were trying to raise her into someone needed. Hammer expanded the lessons with the same slow patience he used to sharpen his knives. He brought her into the kitchen first, but not to bake cookies or teach gentle domestic rituals. He handed her onions and knives, raw meat, and cast iron pans, showed her how to break down ingredients into something that could keep people alive when the world didn't cooperate. "You feed people, you keep them standing," he murmured while steam rose around them. "If things ever fall apart again, you don't wait for someone to save you. You feed yourself, you feed your own." By 11, he took her into the desert itself. She learned the stillness required to track a deer, the breath control needed for a clean shot, the reverence in preparing what they took. She watched Hammer kneel beside each kill, bowing his head, not from religion, but from respect. When he guided her hands through skinning her first deer, his voice was quiet enough to be mistaken for wind. Everything that lives deserves gratitude. Nothing dies for free. It was the first time she understood that survival required both strength and humility. Gunnar entered her world differently. His lessons carried edges and shadows, the kind that made other children shrink away, but made Rosie lean forward. The man who towered over motorcycle frames and welded steel with hands scarred from combat now stood in front of her barefoot on the training mats. He moved with a precision that felt almost too controlled for someone who carried so much unspoken fury. "You're small," he muttered as she squared her stance. "Good. Small is fast. Small gets under defenses. Small survives." Every session left her shaking, bruised forearms, burning lungs, adrenaline humming through her bones. He taught her where to strike if someone grabbed her from behind, how to break grips with leverage, how to make herself impossible to drag away. She repeated each motion until it lived in her muscles, no longer needing fear as fuel. Wrench treated her like an apprentice long before she appreciated the honor in that. Her small hands disappeared under engine blocks, oil dripping across her knuckles as she learned to name every part she touched. At 9, she passed tools. At 10, she disassembled carburetors. At 11, Wrench stood back while she reassembled an entire motor without a single correction. Machines didn't lie, she learned. When you failed them, they stopped. When you respected them, they carried you across vast distances. Something in that honesty comforted her more than adults' smiles ever had. Ledger introduced her to a world without wrenches or grease. Ledger books, budgets, credit scores, interest rates. She couldn't understand why numbers mattered until he laid out the truth plainly. "If you don't understand money," he murmured, "someone else gets to own your choices." He taught her that independence didn't start with strength. It started with knowledge. At 12, she opened her own savings account. By 14, she tracked her expenses with a discipline even grown men in the club lacked. Then there was Flint. He didn't instruct, didn't command, didn't justify his silence. Each Saturday, he simply handed her a piece of wood and a blade, sitting beside her, as the hours stretched without pressure to speak. She carved clumsy figures at first, then smoother shapes, then handles and small boxes. Flint's presence was its own kind of medicine, an unspoken assurance that trauma didn't always require explanation. Sometimes it just needed a witness. By the time Rosie reached her 10th birthday, the compound felt less like a refuge and more like the only world that had ever made sense. That morning, she woke to the rumble of engines forming a protective circle around the yard, the sound as familiar as breathing. Children from school, club families, Wishawa girlfriends, and old veterans gathered under strings of mismatched lights. Wrench unveiled a miniature Harley with purple accents, custom-built training wheels bolted on with the precision of a surgeon. Hammer stirred a giant pot of venison stew, its scent drifting across the yard like an embrace. Grizzly's hands trembled just slightly as he held out a wooden plaque carved with her name and the date she'd entered their lives. Nothing fancy, just the kind of thing men made when they didn't know how to say what they felt. But the biggest shift arrived not from the men, but from a silver Honda rolling through the gates around noon. A woman stepped out, silver hair, eyes soft but brimming with recognition. Rosie froze mid-stride. Grandma, the single word carried years of longing she didn't know she'd been storing. The embrace that followed drew the compound into silence. Even the gruffest men found excuses to wipe at their eyes or shuffle off toward their bikes. That reunion brought joy, but Margaret's whispered conversation with Cole behind the shop added a weight that darkened the edges of the celebration. Ryan Garrett, Nevada prison, violent history, parole eligibility approaching. A name Rosie didn't yet know would eventually become the earthquake under her foundation. Through the following years, adolescence scraped against the life the club had crafted for her. At 13, she tried on rebellion like an ill-fitting jacket, cutting her hair into a jagged pixie, streaking it with purple. She walked into the clubhouse expecting scolding or disappointment. Cole only sighed, studying her with a mixture of resignation and affection, before reminding her that trust meant sharing intentions, not just outcomes. She felt her chest loosen at his restraint. Not everything she realized had to be a battle. At 14, curiosity tangled with old wounds. Research for a school project led her down a trail of archived articles and arrest reports. She found the name, the charges, the mugshot of a man whose features she recognized only because hers carried faint echoes of the same bone structure. Her stomach turned cold when she learned how he had hurt her mother, how violence had trailed behind him like smoke. She confronted Cole that evening with eyes that demanded truth she feared. His response wasn't gentle, it was steady, unyielding, and exactly what she needed. Blood doesn't make destiny. Choice does. The line seared itself into her memory, anchoring her during nights when doubt tried to crawl up her throat. At 15, she earned something no document could match her own bike. A rebuilt Harley Sportster 883 adjusted to her height, tuned to her touch. Cole rode beside her on the first long ride, the sunrise casting molten light over the desert. She pushed the throttle, wind tearing at her jacket, heart pounding, in fierce, unrestrained freedom. Cole watched with the painful pride of someone realizing the child he saved now belonged to the road as much as he did. The day didn't end with triumph. When night fell, Hammer stepped from the clubhouse with an expression Rosie had only seen after funerals. Grizzly had collapsed hours earlier. The hospital couldn't bring him back. Rosie felt something inside her break cleanly, silently, like bones splitting under pressure. She sat beside the fire pit long after everyone else drifted away, staring into the embers, as if expecting his shape to rise from them. Cole joined her, and together they honored the man who had taught her to stand tall, even when fear stalked her every breath. The funeral formalities passed in a blur. Flags, rifles, folded cloth, hands trembling, as taps echoed across the cemetery. But it was later in Flint's workshop where grief finally slipped free. She cried into the scent of sawdust while Flint carved silently beside her, offering the single kind of comfort he understood: presence without demand. In the days that followed, resolve crystallized where despair had cracked her. She sought out Cole in the middle of the night, determined eyes shining in the dim shop lights. "If you die, I lose everything I haven't learned yet." The confession wasn't fear, it was a declaration. She wanted every lesson, every scrap of wisdom, every skill the Brotherhood carried. Not to hoard, but to preserve. To continue what Grizzly had started. Cole recognized the shift immediately. Childhood had ended. Something fiercer, sharper, more intentional was taking its place. The forge was working, and Rosie was beginning to understand she wasn't being shaped only for survival. She was being shaped for purpose. By the time Rosie approached 16, the boundaries that once held her life together began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. Independence no longer felt like a distant horizon. It pressed closer each day, shaping her choices, her temper, and the expectations the Brotherhood quietly held for her. The compound had given her armor skills and a sense of belonging, but adolescence tested every seam of that identity. Her volunteer hours at Copper Ridge Youth Services started innocently enough, just another school requirement she intended to complete without fanfare. Yet the moment she stepped inside the overcrowded facility, a familiar tension crept through her chest. The air hummed with the same kind of quiet desperation she'd once carried, the kind that hid under forced neutrality and long sleeves. Children sat alone at plastic tables, their eyes flicking toward doorways as if calculating escape routes. Others slouched in corners, the hardness in their posture disguising fear. It wasn't grief she recognized in them. It was abandonment. Marcus was the first to draw her attention, not because he demanded it, but because he resisted it. He sat in a corner, arms folded across his chest, gaze sharp but unfocused. A case file sat on a nearby table left open by an overwhelmed counselor. 7 homes in 7 years, behavioral issues, difficult to place. She skimmed the words and felt a hollow ache. Labels didn't describe children. They trapped them. She didn't walk toward him like a savior or a counselor. She simply sat near him at a distance that gave him room to stay or flee. She placed her backpack beside her, opened her notebook, and worked through the kind of math equations she'd mastered years ago. 20 minutes passed before she even looked up. He glanced at her in quick, guarded flickers. She pulled a granola bar from her pocket, placed it between them on the table, and walked away without comment. The gesture wasn't kindness, it was recognition. The next day, the bar was gone. She left another. On the third day, his voice cracked the silence between them. "Why you keep doing that?" His posture remained rigid, but his eyes betrayed hunger, emotional before physical. Rosie kept her answer simple, anchored in truth. "Because someone once did that for me." The admission lodged in his expression, something like disbelief flickering across it. She didn't overwhelm him with biography. She shared fragments, curated memories of cold mornings, cracked pavement, a stranger's leather jacket, brushing against her cheek as a Harley rumbled beneath her. Enough to build trust without reopening wounds she wasn't ready to expose. Marcus listened with the suspicion of someone who'd never received anything without paying a price. But each time she returned, his wariness softened piece by piece. Weeks turned into months. Under Wrench's guidance, Marcus learned to hold tools correctly, his hands shaking less with each passing Saturday. When he replaced his first brake pad, Rosie caught the subtle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't pride in the mechanical accomplishment, it was pride in being treated as capable. Other kids followed Deshaun, Sarah, Lila, and a handful of others referred by counselors who had begun to notice that something was happening when Rosie showed up. They came to the compound hesitantly imagining roaring engines and dangerous men. What they discovered instead were weathered faces softening with patience, calloused hands guiding theirs through real tasks in a kind of honesty they had never encountered. No sugarcoating, no shallow encouragement, just work clarity and belonging. Rosie kept meticulous records not because anyone asked her to, but because she sensed something growing beneath the surface. For every child who walked through the gates, she documented hours spent, progress made, emotional shifts. She snapped photos when permission allowed, hands tightening, Bolt's concentration etched on young brows, tentative smiles forming during moments of breakthrough. She created folders, spreadsheets, and journal entries, tying each snapshot of progress to measurable change. Cole noticed her intensity first. Nights passed with her hunched over her laptop, light spilling through the gaps of her trailer curtains long after others had gone to bed. He didn't intrude. He simply observed, sensing the outline of a mission forming, even if she hadn't yet given it a name. By the fall of her senior year, her growth wasn't just academic or emotional, it was strategic. She spent weekends meeting with shelter staff, absorbing the nuances of their challenges, limited funding, overwhelmed caseworkers, inconsistent foster placements, chronic burnout. She absorbed it all, piecing together a map of systemic failure that felt painfully familiar. At times, the weight of it threatened to crush her resolve, but then she'd see Marcus rebuild a carburetor without instruction, or Deshaun laugh for the first time in months, and the fire inside her reignited. College applications came next. They poured in like small echoes from another universe. Letters from universities impressed by her grades, scholarships, acknowledging her volunteer hours, offers to leave Copper Ridge and step into a world that promised safety and prestige. She stared at the envelopes, their glossy seals catching the light. Every counselor encouraged her to go. Every teacher reminded her she was meant for bigger things. But when she looked out across the compound, the desert stretching endlessly, the clang of tools echoing through open shop doors, the men who had become her anchors, she felt the pull of something greater than a degree. Her future wasn't elsewhere. It was here, rising from scars and dust. She deferred every offer without hesitation. The admissions officers were baffled. Her teachers whispered, but Rosie felt clarity sharpening inside her like a honed blade. That winter, the compound buzzed with an undercurrent none of the men recognized at first: Rosie's relentless questions. She asked Ledger about nonprofit structuring, tax codes, grant applications. She asked Bear about logistics, transportation, safety protocols. She asked Gunner how discipline frameworks could be adapted for teens. She asked Hammer how to keep morale steady in environments built on instability. At first, the men assumed she was simply curious. Over time, they exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the intensity they had once carried during missions. The shift became unmistakable the week before graduation. Rosie requested a mandatory church meeting, something she had never done. Word spread quickly. Brothers carved their schedules open, some driving from neighboring states to attend, drawn by the weight in her voice when she relayed the request. The main hall overflowed, engines cooled outside, their heat shimmering in the evening air as men filed in, younger ones offering seats to older veterans. Rosie stood at the front, her laptop connected to a makeshift projector Wrench had rigged from spare parts. She wore a simple jacket, boots scuffed from years of training, hair tied back to keep distractions away. She didn't shrink from the magnitude of the room, she absorbed it. The lights dimmed. The first slide illuminated behind her. A phoenix rising from stylized flames, wings formed from the spokes of a motorcycle wheel. No title, just a symbol. Brothers, she began, voice steady despite the weight in her chest. I'm proposing something new. The room quieted, breaths held like soldiers awaiting orders. She clicked to the next slide. Statistics filled the wall numbers showing how many youth fell through the cracks each year, how many ended up on the streets, in juvenile detention, in graves far too early. The silence thickened as the reality sank in. She gave no speeches about hope or heroism, only facts crystallizing into purpose. Her next slides mapped out the identity she'd been sculpting, a program where veterans use their skills, mechanics, construction, finance discipline, to support at-risk youth. Workshops, mentorships, emergency housing, apprenticeships, life skills, discipline frameworks built from Marine Corps structure, but softened by compassion. Partnerships already signed, funding already secured. Then she displayed the wait list, names, ages, situations, all kids who needed something the system couldn't provide, something she believed Ironclad could. When she reached the final slide, she stopped talking altogether. It was a photograph she had taken from Cole's private drawer, the gas station curb 13 years earlier. Her tiny frame knees hugged to her chest, eyes hollowed by fear and resignation. And behind her, the faint blur of a Harley pulling in. The room exhaled. Something raw shifted in its center. She placed her hand on the table beside her and let the truth rise. One act of courage saved my life. One decision changed everything. If we choose to act again together, we can do the same for them. Not a plea, not a pitch, a mission. The men glanced at one another, their expressions solemn. They weighed risk time, money scrutiny. They weighed their own broken histories against the possibility of building something that could outlive them. And the answer came not in cheers, but in the quiet nods of men who had been shaped by war and redemption, who recognized a call worth answering. Rosie watched it unfold with a calm forged from years of fire. Her life had been the first life changed. Now she was ready to change many more. The weeks after her presentation carried an energy unlike anything the compound had felt in years. It wasn't celebration, it wasn't shock. It was alignment, the silent way men who had once followed orders now found themselves ready to follow purpose. Rosie sensed it each morning as engines rumbled to life, as tools clattered in workshops, as conversations shifted from routine maintenance to the foundations of a new mission. Phoenix Initiative existed now not as an idea, but as momentum. She spent her days building the infrastructure with a discipline that echoed the lessons she'd absorbed since childhood. Ledger arranged meetings with county officials, ensuring the program's legal structure would withstand scrutiny. Rosie sat beside him in cramped offices, jotting notes faster than staff could answer them. Regulations, zoning, restrictions, liability, waivers. Concepts foreign to most teenagers slotted into her mind with unnerving ease. She didn't chase inspiration, she chased precision. Every evening she walked the perimeter of the compound alone. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Plans built in offices required grounding in the place where they would take root. The trailers, workshops, training mats, fire pits, storage sheds. Each space held potential she mapped meticulously. She imagined where classrooms could form, where temporary housing could expand, where boundaries would need reinforcement to protect both kids and brothers. Sometimes she paused under the desert sky, the kind of sky too vast for doubt, and let the weight of her responsibility settle without crushing her. The first 12 kids entered the program slowly, each through careful coordination with the shelter. Rosie insisted on meeting with every guardian, caseworker, and foster parent personally. She didn't want Phoenix Initiative to feel like a lifeboat snatching kids away from the world. She wanted it to be a beacon drawing them in with agency and respect. The conversations were heavy stories of neglect, trauma, instability, but she listened without flinching. Pain didn't frighten her. Passing it forward did. Saturday mornings shifted dramatically. Instead of a handful of kids wandering the shop, the compound filled with cautious footsteps, uncertain eyes, and quiet bravery. The men adapted instantly, though none would admit how much it stirred something buried deep. Wrench reorganized the garage labeling tools so newcomers could find them. Hammer stocked the kitchen like a field mess, preparing lunches that smelled like comfort rather than charity. Gunner structured physical training sessions that focused on discipline, grounding exercises, and controlled strength. Nothing resembling punishment. Flint set aside fresh blocks of wood each week, his workshop becoming a sanctuary for kids who didn't have words. Rosie moved through each station like a commander checking on her squad. She didn't oversee for authority, she oversaw for care. She watched posture shifts, tracked eye contact, monitored emotional responses with precision, earned from years navigating her own fractures. When someone struggled, she intervened without condescension. When someone excelled, she celebrated quietly, never allowing the moment to overshadow their autonomy. The transformation she witnessed wasn't dramatic. It arrived in small gestures, the way Marcus taught younger kids to sand a piece of wood evenly, the way Deshaun began showing up early just to help Hammer prep food, the way Sarah stood a little straighter each week as her trust deepened. Rosie documented everything. Her folders grew into a living archive of resilience. But behind the progress lurked challenges she couldn't ignore. Some kids brought tempers sharpened by survival. Some arrived suspicious of adults, no matter how gentle the men tried to be. Others broke down mid-session, overwhelmed by memories triggered by unfamiliar scents or sudden noises. Rosie handled each crisis with steadiness beyond her years. She guided breathing exercises, created quiet spaces, taught grounding techniques she'd learned from Gunner's worst nights. She never pretended healing was linear. She simply refused to let setbacks define anyone. The local community's reaction evolved more slowly. At first, Phoenix Initiative drew curiosity, then skepticism. Parents whispered in grocery lines about bikers training foster kids. Church groups debated whether it was safe. Reporters called requesting interviews. Rosie declined until the program built a track record strong enough to speak for itself. She wasn't interested in publicity, she was interested in proof. Proof arrived quietly. One afternoon, a shop owner Rosie had never met approached her after a meeting at the shelter. He'd hired Marcus part-time after hearing about his mechanical aptitude. "He works harder than grown men I've had for years," he marveled. Marcus had used his first paycheck to buy groceries for his foster family. Rosie felt pride swell through her, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Another breakthrough came with a girl named Lisbeth, a 14-year-old prone to panic attacks triggered by loud noises. The compound filled with roaring engines and power tools seemed like the worst environment for her. But Rosie asked Flint to take her on. For weeks, Lisbeth carved in silence, her knife trembling slightly with every stroke. One afternoon, Rosie found her carving a curved shape with remarkable precision. "It's a wing," Lisbeth whispered. "For when I'm ready to fly." Rosie swallowed the emotion, tightening her throat. She didn't tell Lisbeth she was already flying by, carving in a place filled with noise. She let the moment stay pure. The program's rhythm grew more demanding as Rosie balanced school mentoring and logistics. Senior year approached its final quarter. Ceremony planning began. Her classmates cared about prom dresses, college dorms, weekend parties. Rosie cared about grant deadlines, volunteer rosters, and the emotional safety of kids who relied on her. There were nights she fell asleep at the table, face pressed against spreadsheets, only to be woken by Cole draping a jacket over her shoulders with a silent, proud sigh. As graduation neared, the weight of expectation didn't slow her, it fueled her. She spent evenings refining the operational manual for Phoenix Initiative, drafting roles for each brother, outlining boundaries for youth participation. She created checklists for trauma-sensitive interactions, conflict de-escalation, and signs of regression. Every detail mattered. Every misstep could cost a child trust that had taken years to rebuild. Her valedictorian speech loomed, though she barely contemplated it. She wrote it in fragments between tasks, letting memories guide her rather than drafting a polished performance. When the night arrived, the gymnasium hummed with the usual blend of anticipation and nostalgia. Rows of families filled the bleachers. Teachers lined the walls. The Brotherhood took a section near the back, leather denim and weathered faces stark against the pastel dresses and pressed suits. When her name was called, the applause was polite, respectful. But when she stepped onto the stage, the crowd noticed something different. She didn't carry the polished bravado of a typical high achiever. She carried the gravity of someone who had lived two childhoods, the one she survived and the one she rebuilt. Her speech unfolded slowly with the same precision she used when shaping wood beside Flint. She spoke about legacy not in abstract terms, but in the form of men who had taught her how to build, fight, heal, and lead. She spoke about the responsibility of protecting others, the courage required to stop cycles of harm, and the quiet victories that rarely make headlines. She didn't mention Phoenix Initiative by name. She didn't need to. The message lay beneath every sentence. When she finished, the Brotherhood rose as one silent, unified, a formation more meaningful than applause. Other families followed, moved by a truth they couldn't quite articulate. For the first time, the town glimpsed the depth of Rosie's connection to those men. Not danger, not rebellion, a shared code forged from survival and service. After the ceremony, she stood outside beneath the canopy lights as her classmates embraced relatives and posed for photos. The men approached her in a staggered line, each offering their own version of respect. Hammer handed her a small wooden box he'd crafted, its lid engraved with the Phoenix emblem. Wrench placed a custom keychain in her hand, metal wings wrapped around a motorcycle gear. Gunner nodded with the weight of a man who taught her to fight with purpose, not rage. Ledger squeezed her shoulder, passing her a folder containing the latest financial approvals for the program. Cole waited until the others stepped aside. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes carried every memory they'd built, every morning ride, every nightmare, soothed every lesson earned. She felt her throat tighten, but she held the moment like a shield around her heart. The next morning, she woke before sunrise and rode alone, letting the cold desert air cut through her thoughts. Phoenix Initiative had momentum, but she sensed there was more to build, more kids to reach, more structures to stabilize, more dangers she hadn't yet anticipated. Her hands tightened on the handlebars, not from fear but from certainty. She wasn't just following the Brotherhood anymore. She was leading them, and the mission ahead demanded everything she had. Summer settled over Copper Ridge with a heaviness that made the air ripple above the asphalt. Rosie welcomed the heat. It reminded her of the mornings when Cole first taught her how to ride, desert winds cutting across her cheeks, engine vibrations grounding her more deeply than any therapy session ever could. Now at 18, the bike beneath her no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned. Each mile she rode carried the momentum of years spent refusing to let her past define her. The Phoenix Initiative's first full year of operation unfolded with a mix of victories and bruising setbacks. Rosie discovered quickly that helping kids wasn't a straight line. Some arrived confident and left broken after a single bad week. Others showed up trembling and transformed faster than she or the brothers could anticipate. The compound became a living organism, breathing, adjusting, expanding around the needs of the young people passing through its gates. One blistering July afternoon, she watched a group of teens gather around Wrench's shop door waiting for instructions. Their voices carried a mix of laughter and tentative camaraderie. Marcus stood at the center, taller now, shoulders squared, with the kind of strength rooted in self-belief rather than bravado. He'd grown into a leader without even noticing the shift. Rosie noticed. She saw potential in him that mirrored the boy she had once been afraid, angry, desperate for someone to prove he mattered. It wasn't just him. Deshaun had blossomed into a force of steady reliability, volunteering to help new kids acclimate. Sarah moved with the calm confidence of someone who'd reclaimed her voice. Even the quiet ones, Lisbeth, Colleen, Tyler, had become threads in a tapestry, strong enough to withstand pressures no single person could bear alone. But the successes brought new pressures. With each child who thrived, more cases arrived. Each referral carried stories that tested Rosie's emotional reserves. She read files filled with words that once described her life: abandoned, neglected, high-risk, unstable home environment. Sometimes she had to step outside into the desert air just to breathe. The weight only grew heavier when a social worker named Karen brought in a 12-year-old boy trembling so violently he couldn't speak. Bruises ran like dark rivers along his arms, his gaze blank and dissociated. Rosie knelt in front of him, her voice barely above a whisper, as she asked if he wanted a quiet room or to sit outside. He didn't answer, just stared past her at a point no one else could see. She recognized that look too intimately. It was the same expression she had worn on the curb 14 years earlier. Hours later, she found herself pacing behind the garage, fists clenched hard enough to redden her palms. Cole approached from a distance, the crunch of gravel announcing him before he stepped into her line of sight. She didn't speak. Instead, she leaned against him quietly, letting the desert wind cool her anger. He never provided easy answers, but he reminded her through his presence that impossible problems didn't require perfect solutions, only relentless commitment. The boy wasn't the last. By midsummer, referrals doubled. Rosie scrambled to restructure the weekly schedule, adding morning sessions for kids who couldn't stay after school and evening meetings for those whose foster homes were far from the compound. She coordinated with teachers, probation officers, and trauma counselors. She built intake forms, updated legal agreements, and negotiated with district officials who weren't sure whether Phoenix Initiative was a blessing or a liability. Her life narrowed into two spheres, the compound and the youth center. Sleep became optional, meals convenient rather than intentional. She didn't complain. She didn't notice fatigue creeping through her bones. Purpose insulated her from exhaustion until her body demanded payment. It happened on a Wednesday evening after a particularly chaotic day. Two teens had clashed during a training session, triggering memories Rosie had hoped were long buried. She de-escalated the fight, calmed both facilitated apologies, and recorded the incident in her logs. But the adrenaline lingered. Her mind replayed the sounds, raised voices, metal scraping against concrete, the sharp crack of a fist hitting a wall. The echo buzzed inside her chest. Hours later, when the last of the teens had gone home, she collapsed onto a workbench in the shop. The room spun slightly. Her breath caught in uneven gasps. Memories she hadn't invited, nights behind dumpsters, hands grabbing her without warning, the cold certainty that she'd been thrown away, rushed forward with a cruelty she hadn't felt in years. She pressed her palms to her temples as if she could hold her mind still. Cole found her minutes later, posture slumped, forehead beaded with sweat. She didn't try to straighten up or hide her trembling. She let him see the truth even the strongest foundation could crack under relentless strain. His voice eased through the noise in her head, steady and grounded, reminding her that warriors didn't fall apart because they were weak. They fell apart because they kept fighting when no one else would. The next morning, she restructured her schedule, carving out moments for breath between crises. She forced herself to take short breaks, even when guilt clawed at her for stepping away. She understood now that leadership required sustainability, not martyrdom. Still, momentum kept building. More kids came, more bonds formed, more breakthroughs emerged. One afternoon near the end of summer, Rosie stood at the entrance of the compound gates waiting for a new referral. A girl named Jamie, 14, recently removed from a home ravaged by substance abuse. The girl stepped out of the caseworker's car with shoulders hunched forward, chin-tucked, hair hiding her face. Rosie walked toward her, slowly, careful not to crowd her. Jamie didn't look up until Rosie held out a small carving knife Flint had given her years earlier. The handle was wrapped in soft leather, the blade dull enough to be safe but sharp enough to shape wood. "It kept me steady," Rosie murmured. "Maybe it can do that for you." Jamie blinked, uncertain whether to trust the gesture. Then she took the knife, gently turning it over in her hand. Rosie felt the shift immediately, small, fragile, but real. As the days passed, Jamie found refuge in Flint's workshop, carving shapes so small they barely fit on her palm. Flint never asked about her past. He simply carved beside her, the scrape of blades against wood forming a rhythm steadier than words. Rosie watched from a distance, knowing that healing sometimes happened in silence, more profound than any conversation. But while the program thrived, external pressures brewed. Community leaders continued questioning the influence of a motorcycle club on vulnerable youth. Some parents refused to approve their children's participation, citing fears rooted in stereotypes. Rosie faced scrutiny from counselors who doubted the ability of veterans to manage trauma-sensitive work. She answered every challenge with data, testimony, and unwavering composure. But she felt each blow subtle and exhausting. The end of summer marked a turning point. She sat at the fire pit late one night, the same place where Grizzly once laid out the medals that shaped her understanding of service. Flames flickered against the darkness, casting shifting shadows across the yard. She pulled her notebook from her jacket, a leather-bound archive of every child the program had touched. As she flipped through pages filled with progress charts, coping strategies, and handwritten notes, a realization formed with a clarity she hadn't expected. Phoenix Initiative wasn't just functioning, it was working. Not because of her, not because of the brothers, not because of grant structures or systems. It was working because kids recognized truth when they saw it. They recognized sincerity. They recognized a family that asked nothing in return but effort and honesty. They recognized men who refused to give up even when their own scars ran deeper than anyone realized. Rosie closed her notebook and breathed in the warm desert air. She felt the strain of the months behind her, the responsibility of the months ahead, and the steady hum of possibility vibrating beneath her skin. For the first time since she'd begun this journey, she allowed herself to believe that she wasn't just maintaining a program. She was building a legacy. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere behind her, engines cooled in the night, their metal ticking as they settled. Footsteps approached, steady, familiar. Cole stopped beside her, the quiet between them layered with everything they did not need to say aloud. Rosie looked toward the open desert where dawn would soon break. her jaw set with the kind of determination forged only by years of surviving what should have destroyed her. Tomorrow more kids would walk through those gates. Tomorrow she would be ready. And tomorrow Phoenix Initiative would continue rising one life at a time under a sky vast enough to hold every broken story they refused to abandon. Rosie stood at the front of the hall, 200 brothers silent waiting. Her leather vest worn with years of use but still standing strong, reflected the dim light of the clubhouse. The air was thick with the smell of oil smoke and beer, a familiar scent that had become her home. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. Brothers, I'm proposing we establish the Phoenix Initiative. She could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders, every set of eyes trained on her, but she kept her focus. No hesitation, no fear. The first slide came up, the logo she'd designed, a phoenix rising from flames, its wings shaped like the wheels of a motorcycle. She watched her brothers' faces. Some were skeptical, others curious, and a few were already nodding in quiet agreement. She continued. Mission statement: connect at-risk youth with veteran mentorship, skilled trades training, and community support. She paused, letting the words settle. The reality of it hung in the air. This wasn't just a pitch. It was the culmination of years of work, of everything she had learned from Cole and the Brotherhood. It was something real, something they could build not just for the kids, but for the future of the Brotherhood itself. She clicked to the next slide: statistics. The data wasn't pretty, but it was undeniable. Why us? She asked, her voice clear and firm. Because we understand what these kids face. Society discarded us. We built our own family. These kids need the same thing. She paused again, letting her words sink in. She clicked to the next slide. Foster care failure rates, youth homelessness, recidivism, suicide. She let the numbers hang in the room. Each slide was another reason they couldn't say no, another reason they had to act. The system's failing them. We won't. She clicked to the next slide: specifics. I've already filed 501c3 paperwork with Ledger's help. Federal nonprofit status is pending approval. The technicalities mattered, but she knew the real power lay in what they could do together. Not just a charity, not just a project, but a movement, a revolution for these kids. Next slide: budget. $75,000 in seed funding. My scholarship money, donations from local businesses, VFW grant. She could feel the skepticism rise in the air, but she wasn't backing down. She was prepared for this. They would doubt. They always did. I've already secured partnerships. Another click, another slide. Memorandum of Understanding signed with Copper Ridge Youth Services County, Social Services, and the school district. This isn't just talk. It's happening now. She could see the doubt still in some of their eyes, the hesitation. These weren't men who trusted easily, and that was okay. She had learned from the best. She wasn't here to sell them a dream. She was here to sell them the truth. I need your help, she continued, the words coming without hesitation. We're going to need your workshops, mechanics, construction, finance discipline, everything you have taught me. She looked around the room. Emergency housing, brothers' spare rooms, trailer spaces, temporary placements when things get tough. She clicked the slide again. Mentorship, one-on-one time. These kids need men who've survived hell and come out stronger. Your stories, they need to hear from warriors who understand trauma, who've rebuilt from nothing. She took a breath, the final slide appearing on the screen. It was a photo of Cole and her taken at the gas station that day when her life changed. She stared at it for a moment, gathering her thoughts. 10 years ago, she said, her voice softening for a brief moment. One Marine on a motorcycle saved my life with one simple question: you eaten? She met Cole's eyes for the briefest of moments, seeing the pride in them. She had made it this far, and it wasn't just because of her. It was because of him, the Brotherhood. And now it was time to pass that on. That's all it took, she continued. One person refusing to walk away when everyone else had. That's what we're asking. To not walk away. To make sure no kid ends up where I did. Her eyes swept the room, meeting every man's gaze. Some still sat in silence, but others had softened. She had planted the seed. Now it was time to wait for the verdict. I've already started this. We've already got kids on a wait list, referrals coming in. All I need is your commitment. I need you to help me build this." Her eyes lingered on Grizzly, then Bear, then Hammer, the older men who had been through hell and came out the other side, the ones who had taught her everything. There was a long pause. Then Ledger spoke up. "I'm in. I'll run the financial literacy workshops. Weekly, no excuses." One by one, others began to speak. Gunnar, his voice as hard as stone, nodded. "Self-defense training, discipline structures, security protocols." Wrench the mechanic was next. "I'll teach him what I know. Mechanics, welding, basic construction. Whatever they need to keep busy." Hammer's voice rumbled through the room. "Hunting, fishing, survival skills. We need to teach them to provide for themselves." Bear, the steady hand, stood. "Construction. I'll run job site training. I'll give these kids a chance." The room was coming alive. There was energy now, a sense of momentum. Rosie looked around the room, a small smile tugging at her lips. This was happening. This was real. Cole stood up, the room falling silent. "We'll do this right," he said, his voice commanding. "We won't cut corners, but we will protect these kids just like we protect each other." He looked at Rosie. "You're ready for this." Rosie nodded. She had been ready for a long time. The brothers rallied, each one agreeing to contribute in their own way. It wasn't just a nonprofit, it was a new mission, a new purpose. And Rosie was ready to lead it. As the meeting broke up, she felt the weight of the responsibility settling into her bones. This wasn't just a promise to Cole or to the brothers, it was a promise to every kid who had ever been discarded by society, a promise that they wouldn't be forgotten. That night, she sat outside, her back against the cold concrete of the clubhouse, staring at the stars. She knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, but it was a road she was ready to travel. The first year of the Phoenix Initiative wasn't easy. Nothing about it was ever going to be. But the seeds had been planted, and now it was time to see if they would take root. They started small, just a handful of kids at first, all from the Copper Ridge Youth Services. Each one had a story, a history that painted them as lost causes to everyone but Rosie and the brothers. They came from broken homes, foster care, or the streets, no hope, no guidance, no future. But Rosie saw something in them, something that made them worth saving. It wasn't a smooth ride from the start. There were days when she wondered if they were making any progress at all. But those were the days that tested her resolve, the days when the world seemed to be pushing back harder than ever. And those were the days she remembered why they were doing this. Marcus was the first one. 17 years old when he arrived at the compound, he was a product of a system that had failed him over and over. 7 foster homes in as many years, each one a temporary solution that left him more damaged than before. By the time Rosie met him, his file read like a nightmare: violent tendencies, behavioral issues, a high-risk prognosis. But none of that mattered to Rosie. She didn't care about his file. She saw him for what he could be, not what everyone else had written him off as. His first day at the compound was like the others. He sat in the corner, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, staring at everything and everyone with suspicion. His body language screamed resistance, his mind already made up that this place was just another stop in a long series of failed attempts to fix him. Wrench met him at the shop entrance, his face unreadable as he sized Marcus up. The brothers had already seen this kind of defiance before, and they knew how to handle it. "You ever fix anything?" Wrench asked, his voice low, gruff. Marcus looked at him, the corner of his mouth twisting in a half smile, half sneer. "No. Want to learn?" It was a simple offer, one that didn't demand anything in return. Marcus shrugged, unimpressed, but he followed Wrench into the shop anyway. The first lesson was a simple one: oil changes. It was a task so basic, so mechanical, that it didn't seem like much of an introduction to a new life. But the more Marcus worked, the more Rosie saw the walls come down. He was hesitant at first, clumsy even, but the work was honest. It didn't lie to him, didn't promise him anything it couldn't deliver. It was a process, a system with clear rules and results. And when Marcus got something right, when he fixed that first engine, when he turned the wrench and heard the satisfying click of metal fitting just right, a small spark of pride ignited in him. There was something about that moment. It wasn't just a technical achievement. It was something deeper, something personal. He was finally getting his hands dirty, not to survive or to escape, but to create. That's when Rosie realized the system wasn't going to change overnight. This wasn't a quick fix. But it was a start, and that was all they needed. As the months passed, the group grew. More kids came in referred by social workers, by the shelter, or by other community services. Some came kicking and screaming, dragging their feet, and lashing out in the face of a world they didn't trust. Others, like Deshaun, came with nothing left to lose. Deshaun was 14, his life upended by homelessness. He had been sleeping in school bathrooms, showering at truck stops. He'd lost his family, his sense of belonging, and his future all in one cruel wave. When Rosie first saw him, he had his head down, shoulders hunched, eyes darting around the compound like a trapped animal. Hammer, who was more of a father figure than anyone cared to admit, took him under his wing. He didn't try to teach Deshaun anything too quickly. No, Hammer was patient. He made sure the kid had something to eat, something to do. And then he taught him how to fish, how to take care of himself in the wilderness, how to survive when everything else was stripped away. Deshaun was a fast learner. He went from angry and untrusting to a quiet, steady presence. His grades went up slowly at first, then steadily as he began to trust the process. The little things mattered: the home-cooked meals, the stable roof over his head, the idea that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a lost cause. But there were setbacks too. The weight of trauma never really goes away, no matter how much effort you put into healing. There were nights when Rosie would hear crying from one of the rooms in the trailer court, or see a kid in the middle of a panic attack paralyzed by memories they couldn't outrun. But the brothers were always there, ready to help, ready to listen. No one was ever turned away. Rosie knew it wasn't perfect. There were too many kids, too many problems, and not enough resources. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had a vision, and she knew that if they stuck together, they could build something real, something bigger than just a safe place to crash. Ledger was handling the finances, keeping everything above board, even though the IRS had already come knocking a few times. But he had a plan. He knew how to make the numbers work, even when the odds were stacked against them. He spent countless hours crunching the numbers, finding grants, securing donations. It was a grind, but Ledger didn't mind. He believed in what they were doing, even if the world outside wasn't ready to see it. Each week there were more successes, more kids making progress, taking steps toward a future that hadn't seemed possible just a few months ago. They were learning to trust, learning to build something better than the broken homes they'd come from. One afternoon, just after sunset, Rosie stood in front of the compound watching the kids file in for dinner. They were laughing, talking to each other, acting like kids again. It was a beautiful sight, and for the first time in a long time, Rosie allowed herself to feel proud. They were building something here. Not just a shelter, not just a place to hide. They were building lives. She thought about the road ahead, about the challenges still waiting to be faced. There would be more battles, more obstacles. But she was ready. She'd come a long way from that gas station curb. And now she was ready to fight for every kid who came through those gates. The first year of the Phoenix Initiative wasn't easy. Nothing about it was ever going to be. But the seeds had been planted, and now it was time to see if they would take root. They started small, just a handful of kids at first, all from the Copper Ridge Youth Services. Each one had a story, a history that painted them as lost causes, to everyone but Rosie and the brothers. They came from broken homes, foster care, or the streets. No hope, no guidance, no future. But Rosie saw something in them, something that made them worth saving. It wasn't a smooth ride from the start. There were days when she wondered if they were making any progress at all. But those were the days that tested her resolve, the days when the world seemed to be pushing back harder than ever. And those were the days she remembered why they were doing this. Marcus was the first one. 17 years old when he arrived at the compound, he was a product of a system that had failed him over and over. 7 foster homes in as many years, each one a temporary solution that left him more damaged than before. By the time Rosie met him, his file read like a nightmare: violent tendencies, behavioral issues, a high-risk prognosis. But none of that mattered to Rosie. She didn't care about his file. She saw him for what he could be, not what everyone else had written him off as. His first day at the compound was like the others. He sat in the corner, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, staring at everything and everyone with suspicion. His body language screamed resistance. His mind already made up that this place was just another stop in a long series of failed attempts to fix him. Wrench met him at the shop entrance, his face unreadable as he sized Marcus up. The brothers had already seen this kind of defiance before, and they knew how to handle it. "You ever fix anything?" Wrench asked, his voice low gruff. Marcus looked at him, the corner of his mouth twisting in a half smile, half sneer. No. Want to learn? It was a simple offer, one that didn't demand anything in return. Marcus shrugged, unimpressed, but he followed Wrench into the shop anyway. The first lesson was a simple one: oil changes. It was a task so basic, so mechanical, that it didn't seem like much of an introduction to a new life. But the more Marcus worked, the more Rosie saw the walls come down. He was hesitant at first, clumsy even, but the work was honest. It didn't lie to him, didn't promise him anything it couldn't deliver. It was a process, a system with clear rules and results. And when Marcus got something right, when he fixed that first engine, when he turned the wrench and heard the satisfying click of metal fitting just right, a small spark of pride ignited in him. There was something about that moment. It wasn't just a technical achievement. It was something deeper, something personal. He was finally getting his hands dirty, not to survive or to escape, but to create. That's when Rosie realized the system wasn't going to change overnight. This wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start, and that was all they needed. As the months passed, the group grew. More kids came in, referred by social workers, by the shelter, or by other community services. Some came kicking and screaming, dragging their feet, and lashing out in the face of a world they didn't trust. Others, like Deshaun, came with nothing left to lose. Deshaun was 14, his life upended by homelessness. He had been sleeping in school bathrooms, showering at truck stops. He'd lost his family, his sense of belonging, and his future, then all in one cruel wave. When Rosie first saw him, he had his head down, shoulders hunched, eyes darting around the compound like a trapped animal. Hammer, who was more of a father figure than anyone cared to admit, took him under his wing. He didn't try to teach Deshaun anything too quickly. No, Hammer was patient. He made sure the kid had something to eat, something to do, and then he taught him how to fish, how to take care of himself in the wilderness, how to survive when everything else was stripped away. Deshaun was a fast learner. He went from angry and untrusting to a quiet, steady presence. His grades went up slowly at first, then steadily, as he began to trust the process. The little things mattered: the home-cooked meals, the stable roof over his head, the idea that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a lost cause. But there were setbacks too. The weight of trauma never really goes away, no matter how much effort you put into healing. There were nights when Rosie would hear crying from one of the rooms in the trailer court, or see a kid in the middle of a panic attack, paralyzed by memories they couldn't outrun. But the brothers were always there, ready to help, ready to listen. No one was ever turned away. Rosie knew it wasn't perfect. There were too many kids, too many problems, and not enough resources. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had a vision, and she knew that if they stuck together, they could build something real, something bigger than just a safe place to crash. Ledger was handling the finances, keeping everything above board, even though the IRS had already come knocking a few times. But he had a plan. He knew how to make the numbers work, even when the odds were stacked against them. He spent countless hours crunching the numbers, finding grants, securing donations. It was a grind, but Ledger didn't mind. He believed in what they were doing, even if the world outside wasn't ready to see it. Each week there were more successes, more kids making progress, taking steps toward a future that hadn't seemed possible just a few months ago. They were learning to trust, learning to build something better than the broken homes they'd come from. One afternoon, just after sunset, Rosie stood in front of the compound watching the kids file in for dinner. They were laughing, talking to each other, acting like kids again. It was a beautiful sight, and for the first time in a long time, Rosie allowed herself to feel proud. They were building something here, not just a shelter, not just a place to hide. They were building lives. She thought about the road ahead, about the challenges still waiting to be faced. There would be more battles, more obstacles, but she was ready. She'd come a long way from that gas station curb, and now she was ready to fight for every kid who came through those gates. Rosie took another deep breath, her heart pounding, as she looked over the room, the 200 brothers now staring back at her. Their expressions were unreadable, their silence pressing against her like a wall. But the moment she started speaking, she knew she'd made the right choice. "Brothers, I'm proposing we establish the Phoenix Initiative." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She clicked to the first slide on the projector, revealing the logo. She'd designed herself a phoenix rising from flames, its wings integrated with a motorcycle wheel. Mission statement: to connect at-risk youth with veteran mentorship, skilled trades training, and community support. She clicked to the next slide. A chart appeared on the screen listing the stark statistics, foster care failure rates, youth homelessness, recidivism rates, and the terrifying rise of suicide among young people in the system. Why us? She asked, her voice steady. Because we understand what these kids are going through. Society discarded us, but we built our own family. These kids need the same thing. She clicked again, and the next slide revealed more data, detailed, methodical, carefully researched. The system is failing them. We won't. The room was still silent, but the eyes of the brothers around her softened. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their experience, their lives, all weighing down on her words. They were deciding whether she was another dreamer, another kid with an idea that would fizzle out, or whether she was telling them something worth backing. How will it work? Rosie continued, flipping through the slides, her pace picking up. I've already filed for 501c3 status with Ledger's help. We'll be a registered nonprofit federally recognized. I've also secured $75,000 in seed funding from my scholarship money, local businesses, and a VFW grant. She clicked again and the next slide appeared. A photo of the kids already on the wait list, their names and ages, 20 kids, who'd already been referred by Copper Ridge Youth Services. These kids are already on the list, all referred by social services, all at high risk. Rosie looked out over the room, making eye contact with every man in her audience. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but there was no turning back now. The path ahead was clear. Here's what I need from you, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Your workshops, mechanics construction, finance discipline, everything you've taught me. She clicked the slide again. It displayed the list of what they needed to provide: emergency housing in brothers' trailers, mentorship workshops, and a commitment to protecting the kids. We will give them what they need, not just what the system gives them. We will be the men they need us to be, just like you've all been for me. She felt a shift in the room. The air felt a little less heavy now. She could see some brothers nodding, others leaning in a little closer, sensing that there was something real here. I'm not asking you to just stand by me, Rosie continued, her voice firm. I'm asking you to help me change lives. We can't keep doing what we've always done, not when we have the power to do something more. The final slide appeared, a photo of Cole and her taken the day they'd met at the gas station. Her hand was on his arm, and she looked up at him with a mix of trust and gratitude. Her voice softened just a little. 10 years ago, one Marine on a motorcycle saved my life with one simple question. You eaten? That's all it took. One person refusing to walk away when everyone else had. We've all been saved by that same kind of courage. Now it's our turn to pass it on. Her eyes sought Cole out in the crowd. He was sitting at the front, his face unreadable, but she could see the pride in his eyes. And she knew without a doubt that this was the right path. She clicked off the projector, and the room was silent again. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Rosie held her breath, her hands clasped together in front of her, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. Finally, Ledger stood up. I'm in, he said, his voice quiet but sure. I'll run the financial literacy workshops. Weekly. No excuses. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. One by one, the brothers began to speak. Gunnar, sitting with his arms crossed, nodded. Self-defense training, discipline structures, security protocols. Wrench stood from the back of the room, his large frame looming, but his voice soft. Automotive classes in my shop, welding, paid apprenticeships for kids who proved themselves. Hammer cleared his throat, wiping a hand across his face. Hunting, fishing, survival skills. Teaching, self-sufficiency. Bear, always the steady one, leaned forward. Construction. I'll coordinate job site training through my company. Rosie's heart soared. One by one, the brothers were offering their skills, their time, and their resources. She'd been prepared for resistance, for hesitation, but now she could see the support. The brotherhood was behind her. Cole stood, his face unreadable, as he made his way to the front. He looked at her, then at the room. There was a long pause. And then in his gruff voice, he spoke the words that sealed the deal. I never thought I'd see the day we'd be doing something like this, he said, his voice raspy but full of conviction. But Rosie's right. This is what we do. We take care of our own, and it's time we expanded that family. The room was silent, but this time it was the silence of agreement. We do this right, Cole said, his eyes sweeping the room. No half measures, no shortcuts. The brothers nodded, their faces set determined. Rosie's vision was taking shape, becoming more than just an idea. It was becoming a reality. A reality they were all ready to fight for. The first 6 months. The reality sets in the first 6 months of the Phoenix Initiative passed in a blur of activity. Rosie could barely keep up with the demand, but there was no turning back now. Each week brought new challenges, but also new victories. The momentum had built, and there was no way she would let it stop. The compound, which had once been just a place of rest and refuge for the ironclad brothers, was now transforming into a headquarters for change. The shop, once filled only with bikes and tools, now hosted a group of young people eager to learn and ready to embrace a new way of life. Rosie had made sure that every day was filled with purpose, every lesson was meaningful. Her phone rang constantly with updates from the community. The kids who had signed up for the program were starting to show real results. Their grades improved, their confidence grew, and the brothers were making it happen. Every single one of them had bought into the cause with no reservations. But it wasn't without its challenges. Rosie had anticipated the difficulties of working with kids from broken homes, many of whom had been discarded by the system. But nothing could have prepared her for the emotional toll it would take on her or the strain it would put on the brotherhood. The line between mentorship and parenthood was blurred, and as each month passed, it became harder to tell where the job ended and her personal life began. It was early autumn when Marcus, one of the first kids to join, came to her in the middle of the night, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "I don't know what to do," Miss Rosie, Marcus said, his voice cracking as he spoke. He was only 14, but the weight of his past hung on him like a dark cloud. He had bounced through foster homes, each one more unstable than the last. "I can't go back to my mom's. I can't go back to the streets." Rosie sat down next to him, the chill of the night air cutting through the walls of the trailer. She knew what it meant for a kid like Marcus to admit that. It meant he trusted her, and she wasn't going to let him down. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you don't have to go back. You're here now. You're safe." Marcus shook his head. "But it's too late for me. I don't have any hope left." Rosie felt the weight of his words, the heaviness of all the kids she was trying to help. She knew she couldn't fix everything, couldn't heal all their wounds. But she also knew she couldn't let him slip through the cracks. She stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the dark sky, her thoughts racing. The brothers had been right about one thing: this wasn't going to be easy. The system was broken, and the kids who were supposed to be protected were left to fend for themselves. But that didn't mean she was going to stop trying. "We don't give up on people," Rosie said, turning back to face Marcus, her voice strong. "That's not who we are. You've got a future here, Marcus. It's going to be hard. Hell, it already is. But we're going to figure it out together. You've got a family now. And we don't leave our family behind." Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but something in her words seemed to reach him. He nodded slowly, a small glimmer of hope breaking through the storm in his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'll try." And that was all Rosie needed, a glimmer of hope. That was enough to keep going. The Brotherhood steps in. As the weeks turned into months, the Brotherhood rallied behind Rosie's mission. They each took on roles, each contributing their own unique skills. Gunnar, with his military background, led self-defense training for the kids. He taught them how to handle situations where words couldn't keep them safe. Wrench, always the patient one, taught them mechanics, showing them how to rebuild engines from the ground up. Hammer, with his decades of survival knowledge, taught them the basics of hunting, fishing, and self-sufficiency. The skills they imparted went beyond just the mechanics of a trade. They were teaching these kids how to survive in a world that had abandoned them. But as the program grew, so did the complications. CPS visits became routine. Every month, a caseworker would show up at the compound, inspecting the records, interviewing the kids, asking questions about the living arrangements, the safety protocols, and the mentorship system. Rosie had known from the beginning that they would be under a microscope. The very fact that they were a motorcycle club, a group of men with pasts that were far from clean, was enough to raise red flags. But Rosie was prepared. She made sure everything was above board. The paperwork was meticulous. The children were always well taken care of, and the brothers were as professional as they could be. Still, there were whispers in the community, some supportive, some filled with suspicion. The more the program grew, the more attention it attracted. Some of it was positive. Local businesses began offering support, whether through donations or hiring some of the kids who had completed the training. Other veterans groups reached out, impressed by the impact the Phoenix Initiative was having. But there were those who weren't so pleased. The whispers of discontent started to spread, and soon there were calls for investigation. Some parents didn't want their kids involved with a group of bikers. Some were outright hostile. They didn't trust the brothers, and they didn't trust the idea of a group of outlaws taking care of their children. The first real test came in the form of a phone call late one night. Rosie was in the shop with Marcus when her phone rang. She saw the number and knew immediately it wasn't good news. It was a local journalist who had been digging into the Phoenix Initiative. They had questions, dangerous questions. "Ms. Anderson," the reporter's voice was smooth but firm, "can you confirm that Ironclad MC is using the Phoenix Initiative to further their own criminal activities?" The words hit Rosie like a punch to the gut. She'd anticipated this, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. "No," Rosie said, her voice calm but her mind racing. "That's not what we're doing here." The reporter didn't seem convinced. "So you're saying there's no connection between Ironclad MC and illegal activities?" "No," Rosie repeated, her grip tightening on the phone. "The only thing we're doing here is trying to help kids. We've got a long way to go, but that's all this is." "If you're asking if we've done something wrong, the answer is no." The reporter didn't let up. "We've received multiple tips from anonymous sources that suggest otherwise. Do you mind if we take a look at your records?" Rosie's mind raced. She knew they were trying to provoke her, trying to get something they could twist into a headline. But she couldn't let that happen. "I'm happy to show you everything," she said, her voice steady, "but we're not hiding anything. We've been transparent from the start. If you want to report on the facts, you are welcome to come down and see for yourself." The line went silent for a moment. Then the reporter spoke again, more cautiously this time. "We'll get back to you." Rosie hung up the phone, her heart still racing. The last thing she needed was a media storm. She turned to Marcus, who had been watching her closely, his expression filled with a concern. "Don't worry, Marcus," she said, trying to sound confident. "We've got this. No one is going to take this away from us." But as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. And it wasn't going to be easy. The kids keep coming. Despite the rising pressure from the outside world, the kids kept coming. They kept showing up, kept working, kept learning. And slowly, very slowly, things started to shift. The first few months had been a scramble, getting things off the ground, finding resources, handling the kids' emotional and physical needs. But as the program stabilized, Rosie could see the difference in the kids who had stuck around. They were starting to believe in themselves. They were starting to feel like they had a future. She watched Marcus the first time he rebuilt an engine on his own, the way his hands shook with pride as he showed it off to the brothers. She saw Deshawn, who had once been homeless, now standing tall, holding down a steady job at a local garage. And when Sarah, who had been on the verge of suicide when she first arrived, finally smiled genuinely for the first time in months, Rosie knew they were doing something right.